We are live. Thanks everybody for joining us today for lead scoring that actually drives revenue. So we're sorry, 1 second. Cool. Dave's muted. Hopefully he knows that. But all right, cool. Awesome. My name is Jason Albert. I'll be moderating today. We've got an awesome panel here with us. We have Omer, co-founder and CTO at Explorium. He's a data scientist and software engineer. He's got more than a decade of experience building machine learning models that drive big business forward. After owning that craft at Microsoft, led data science teams at AdTech, Unicorn, Iron Source, by establishing architecture of high-scale machines that generate revenue to the tune of 9 digits annually. I'm going to have you unpack that for me at some other point, because that sounds really impressive, but I'm not sure what all that is.
That was the goal.
Make it sound complicated. It sounds impressive. Awesome. We have Jane with us as well from Explorium. She's our customer-facing data scientist. Jane brings a track record of solving data science initiatives from end to end, whether that's developing enrichment solutions, generating data, or building predictive machine learning models. She's successfully been the technical lead directly interfacing with clients and prospects across multiple industries: fintech, retail, CPG, insurance, real estate, just to name a few. She's working on design and execute data science projects with an understanding of Explorium's capabilities and client needs. Awesome. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Next up, we have one of my favorite people in the world. Dave is joining us from Astronomer, where I worked with him. Dave's an absolute joy to work with. He's actually a data scientist, data analyst that can speak in layman's terms. So much so that we had him actually teaching a weekly session with our sales team whenever we were over there. But Dave's got 10 plus years experience with large companies and VC-backed startups, specialization in supporting go-to-market functions through data and operational excellence, and building data platforms that deliver data products at the speed of business. He's an expert in SQL and Python and experience across all database platforms and data applications. And I'm here to tell you, Dave took us to a whole different level at Astronomer. So super excited to have you on, Dave.
Thanks so much, Jason. Appreciate it.
Awesome. And then I'm Jason Albert. I'm COO at RevGenius. Obviously worked with Dave at Astronomer, as well as a variety of other early stage startups, working primarily in demand gen, marketing, growth, partnerships, stuff like that. All right, let's hop right into it. So, like I said, today we're talking about data science driven lead scoring that actually drives revenue. That's something that's near and dear to my heart. Where I've actually played around with a lot of different, machine learning, AI models, stuff like that for lead scoring. To say the least, it's been hit or miss over the last 15, 20 years. And that might be being courteous with it. So, but obviously with everything that everybody's seen with AI and ChatGPT and stuff like that, that landscape is rapidly changing. And Unifor is one of the ones that are really out here helping to push the envelope with that. So lead scoring, of course, has been around for forever. The idea is not all leads are created equally. If you're following up with all of them the same way, then you're not going to be efficient with what you're doing. And where you're going to miss opportunities, you're not going to spend the time and attention where you need to. Historically, lead scoring has largely worked better in a B2C context than a B2B context. B2B's really been a struggle, as I alluded to. Maybe it's because we've been doing it longer, maybe because it's more sophisticated modeling, because there's more money there. We'll actually jump into that as our first sort of question and figure out kind of what people's take on that. But today we're going to talk about specifically B2B lead scoring and how to actually dial that in and make that effective, which has been a challenge and sort of holy grail within the B2B space for a long time now. So let's go ahead and pose that first one. Why have we been more effective in the B2C space than B2B when it comes to lead scoring? Who wants to go first?
I can do that.
Let's go.
I think I hear a heckle, but that's fine. Yeah, so in many cases, and we're doing, and I've been doing for B2C, also lead scoring for B2C for a while now. One of the things that is very apparent when you do that is when you usually work with B2C, you have much more data, like in terms of rows. You have just more rows, more users, you can run that. And that means on the other spectrum is that once you have a model and you score all of your leads, you have more room for optimization, which means that if you have 10,000 users coming into your website and you want to approach each one of them, maybe send an email, maybe call them up, it's much better if you have 10,000 than you have 10, right? If you have 10, you probably don't want to optimize at all and just call them all. So I think that the optimization actually is driven from the segmentation. Basically, a lot of users mean that you need to optimize because you don't have enough resources, and then you need to create lead scoring or segmentation, whatever you want to do when you work on B2B versus B2C.
Absolutely. Jane, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I agree with Omer, and adding on to what he said, like traditionally a lot of the success with B2C scoring is because of the large amount of data that's available and also the signals that we have on them. So if you take LTV, for example, or customer lifetime value modeling, often data scientists, they've got a lot of the demographics of those individuals as well as their behavior and their interactions with you. But I think that this is also limited. I mean, that's mostly for use cases in the US, whereas in the EU, like there's a lot more restrictions with GDPR, and often it's not a lot of data to model off of. So local businesses or SMBs, there actually can be a lot of data, as Omer was mentioning, both like in the US and in the EU, since there are less regulations on businesses. So when we supplement that with external data, we can actually see success. So a lot of those alternative sources can allow you to hone in on these SMBs globally and understand their firmographic, their presence in the area, their online behavior, their growth indicators recently, making this use case more comparable in terms of data availability to the B2C use cases. And then if we're talking globally and compared to the EU specifically, it can even be stronger since we're dealing with less restrictions.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's definitely one of the things you've got to be really careful with is as you're navigating different regulations and legal frameworks and stuff like that. This has huge implications in what you can do and how you have to tactically come in and actually do this stuff.
For sure.
Yeah,
Dave, what's your take on it?
Yeah, it's not going to be a surprise. I think throughout this webinar, there's going to be a lot of overlap, but I totally agree with everything that Omer and Jane said. I think what I could add here is that as you incorporate, so scoring an individual, I think in general, or scoring one thing in one dimension is a lot easier than scoring two things. As soon as you introduce scoring at a B2B level, you're not only scoring the activities and the profile of the individual, but now you're looking at the company and the account as well. So now you have two objects that you have to manage instead of one. So just on that basis, two is bigger than one. And in that way, I think it gets more complicated and a lot of people miss the mark. I think something that Jane touched on is really important though as well. B2B data is a little bit of guesswork, right? So, and since lead scoring is usually run by sales and marketing people, like no offense, they don't necessarily have the technical skills to do simple things like identity management, right? Which is the basis for a lot of your lead and account scoring. So you start using the dark funnel and anonymized data, and the results become inconsistent and unreliable, like you mentioned, Jason. So that's my addition to that.
Yeah, one thing that I can add.
Oh, come on! Don't throw a marketer. Good, Omer. Sorry.
Sorry about that. No, one thing that I would add about what Dave said, which I completely agree, but I'm going to add kind of double click on that. It's true that for B2B is more difficult. That's true. You need the right tooling for that. That's completely true. However, just on the spectrum between B2C, think about B2SMB companies as a good example of how you can use lead scoring in a good way. So if we talked about the just sheer amount of data that you have, B2SMB companies, in which I mean companies that actually sell to small businesses and usually kind of deal with, hundreds of thousands and sometimes even more than that. Customers actually can use lead score in a very successful way, assuming that you have the right data and the right tools to build that. So kind of on the spectrum between B2C and B2B, you have a kind of a middle ground where B2SMB companies also have the same amount of records, so they can build models. And from what Jane said, we can also infer that because there is less restriction on B2B, you can get more data. So B2SMB is kind of a sweet spot in terms of what you can do with lead scoring there.
It's great insight. And yeah, like I alluded to as I was kicking off, this is something I've had a lot of experience with, both as a consumer of lead scoring platforms, but also, I was a early beta user of Everstring, if people remember that, Mentigo, all of those that came out. It was like, we're going to revolutionize lead scoring. We actually at Cirrus Insight predated that. So we're like, hey, we've got access to inboxes and we've got access to Salesforce. Like, that's an awesome amount of data. And so we went and hired, I'm here in Knoxville, we went and hired some of the leading researchers and data scientists out of Oak Ridge National Lab. We're like, hey, let's build like the first successful B2B lead scoring model. The problem we ran into is exactly what we led with. The volume of data was not sufficient for us to pull anything out of there that was anything that was operationalizable or really giving us much of a lift from that. And I was having the same conversation around ChatGPT. They're like, ooh, I wonder if we can plug this into HubSpot and Salesforce and get some great insights out of it. And I was like, been down that road. Like, your volume, you got to have a really big CRM, and you got to be pushing a lot of activity to have this be in a place where you can actually pull something that's very interesting and reliable out of it.
Yeah, and Jason, I don't want to send us down too much of a tangent, but I think something that you're touching on right now that I'm seeing a lot with the introduction of new technology like OpenAI, ChatGPT, right, is that a lot of these low code / no code tools that people have built can't extend to these new technologies that are introduced. So I almost see this as like a huge paradigm shift, especially when it comes to data, is that people are starting to realize the limitation of no code / low code. And they're starting to appreciate a little bit more, full code solutions, if you will, right? Yep. In order to integrate all of these new amazing technologies and tools. That's just like a meta trend that I've seen. And I think you kind of hit on it with your last comment.
Yeah, I mean, even on the no-code front, most of the interesting things that they're getting out of those tools that you just mentioned is by really, really dialing in the questions you're asking. And so you may not be doing it in code, but like you're getting really, really nuanced with the instructions that you're giving it. I keep thinking it's sort of back to like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Be careful what question you ask the computer. You might get 42 out of it. So, which is funny. I actually have a computer that's broken down right now. That's the CPU code it's giving me is a 42. I was like, oh, thanks, guys. Well, cool. We've already sort of touched on this, but it's a great segue into what do you guys really think fundamentally has been the challenge on the B2B front? And what are some of the things we're going to have to overcome in order to actually get this to a place where it's providing value? Omer, did you want to go first?
Sure. So I think that the B2B lead scoring overall it's just more difficult than the B2C. If you think about, we mentioned about the kind of the size of the data, and if you don't have enough CRM, then you probably enough records in your CRM, so it's harder. I, in many cases, think about that as edge computing versus backend. Just let me explain, because I know it's a lot to unpack. When you think about edge computing and you think about things that needs to run on the browser, then you have a different set of tools that you need to use in order to create that type of a software, let's say, than when you have regular servers when you want to work with. It's just a matter of what type of tools are you using. When you have a small number of leads, I wouldn't say on the dozens, but definitely on the high hundreds or even thousands, then you will be able to build B2B lead scoring. It will be different models. It will be different data sources that you will incorporate in that lead scoring model. However, it is possible, and you can get a lot of benefit from that. Taking that to the next step, you have B2SMB, where you can apply regular machine learning, and this is where most of the lead scoring shine the most. And in the far end, you have the B2C, which is kind of let's say, a decade-long technology that's being built. That's
Great.
my take.
Great. Jane, I assume you know your camera's off. Are you still with us? She might have stepped away. So, Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, I could pick up on that. Again, this is going to be a recurring theme, is like data infrastructure, right? If you don't have data infrastructure to support B2B lead scoring, that's one of the first things that you have to do to improve it. Very simple example. Can you match someone coming in that has a Gmail address to their company? Like, do you have the internal tools or data skills to be able to do that basic blocking and tackling? If the answer is no, how are you going to supplement that? Are you going to have some type of progressive profiling? Are you going to ask people for the information that you want to know? Jason, you'll appreciate this. Almost every B2B lead scoring model that I've built has been based off of, is this customer using X software, right? If you don't have a way to identify that consistently, obviously none of your signals are going to be great. So I think actually building the infrastructure, gathering the data, and doing that, like the dirty work that's not as sexy as building an ML model, is really, really, really important. And then beyond that, right, just as like an add-on, is that B2B scoring models usually fail because they only look at the account. I think that's what a lot of huge companies that raise $500 million, that's what they do. They just start looking at the account. They forget about the individual, when you actually need to be scoring both of those objects so that you can almost create your own magic quadrant for customers, right? A customer should have a very high individual lead score and their account should look really good in order for you to target them. But most of the time, people just go straight to B2B lead scoring, and then they're upset when they can't connect to the individual that's going to drive that purchase. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, but don't you think there is a value in, so imagine that you have a lead coming from, and there is a different story about inbound leads versus outbound leads. You can also score them, but let's talk about the inbound, what you said. Don't you think that there is a value if you know that there's a certain company, a certain person in a company addressed, had the intent to actually send you, let's say, asking to meet with sales, even if this persona, even if the account is great, and even if this persona is not great for you, it's still a valuable lead for sales, because then they can have kind of collateral move within their organization in order to get to the same persona that they need. So
Yes.
I completely agree with you. I definitely think that any lead scoring should also have kind of focus both on the account level and on the personal level to identify that. But from a sales perspective, I would want to have both.
Oh, totally. I think I keep like making my little chart with my hands here, right?
Yeah.
And obviously you want to prioritize what's in the upper right-hand quadrant, but there's definitely going to be like the lower right-hand quadrant, right? Low account, the account doesn't look good. It's in an industry that we're not really good at penetrating yet, but they've gone to all our webinars. They've clicked all these links in an email. To your point, Omar, 110%. You should still be going at those. But what this lead scoring model does is it gives you different approaches, right? Because I think you're going to approach the upper right-hand quadrant a little bit different than the lower right-hand quadrant, don't you think?
For sure, for sure. And I think that this is exactly, when we talk about lead scoring overall, we don't think about that only as an inbound, a model only for inbound. So imagine that as well as you have your inbound leads coming in, now you build a model that you're not running only on those, but you're actually running on millions and millions of different companies that we have, in a database. So now you can run that through it and say, well, from all of the businesses that you just scored, millions of them, I found 500, which might be a net new that you don't know about before, that now you want to address, and those will be the best one, the closest to your ICP, and so on. The interesting part to address what you said is that those are not regular outbound leads that you just want to send an email to, because those are much better for your ICP than anything that you have currently on the outbound funnel. So what you actually want to do is make sure that your SDR is calling them. You want to make sure that you can approach them. If you're a CPG company, that you probably want to send your FSL, your field sales reps to them. So there is a lot to do once you know that they're a good ICP, a good customer, whether it is inbound or outbound, it doesn't really matter, because you know that there is a different approach that you need and different investment in resources that you want to make sure to invest in order to get those sign in.
Agree 100%.
Yeah, and one piece that, you know, we've sort of danced around with a lot of stuff, but I really think it boils down to this at the end of the day. You know, with limited data, so we don't have like, you know, huge, you know, terabyte, you know, data sets, stuff like that to chew through. So we're limited in how much we can pull insights out of, and you know, a smaller data set that we're working with. Also, all signals are not created equally. We touched on it with, like, you know, having to be careful with the questions that you ask, you know, whether it's asking your data analyst, like I did with Dave whenever I was working with them, or asking a no-code, you know, model or tool. You know, you've got to be careful with the questions you're asking. And what all of this boils down to is if you're actually intentional about the data that you're feeding into your model, and you're careful about the questions you're asking it to answer, you can solve for a lot of these things that we're talking about as issues or blockers on this. Where it's come up short, I think, is where people did, you know, things like we tried to do at Cirrus, where it's like, hey, if we just throw every data point we have at this, what insights are going to fall out of it? And that's not a particularly effective model to try and use when it comes to leveraging, you know, tools like this. Jane, you're back. You're having some weather issues, I hear.
Yes, I'm back. I'm in New York City. I see some rain, so maybe there's a storm coming my way. Apologies. I lost Wi-Fi for a little bit, but I'm back.
Great
Jane,
to have
you
you
left
back.
me alone with those two guys. I was frightened.
I knew you
was
could.
very frightened.
Well, cool. Jane, I know you were out of the context of the conversation, but, you know, anything to make sure that you wanted to add on the, you know, issues that we're trying to tackle relative to B2B lead scoring specifically?
Yeah, I'm sure you guys covered most of it, but I think the biggest thing is a model is, you know, only as good as the data that you feed it at the end of the day, whether it's inbound, outbound, or a B2C model. So having good internal data, as well as supplementing that with the external sources and a wide variety of them. So you're not just looking at the geographic viewpoint or just the firmographic viewpoint, getting that full 360, that's really how you're going to get the best results, regardless of the specifics of your use case.
Great.
Yeah, just
Great.
I want to pick up on what Jane said. Like, I'm a really big fan of a consensus method. You talked a little bit, Jason, about overfitting based on the questions you asked and how you build the model. Like, the best way to avoid overfitting or baking your bias into the model is having like a consensus of signals and data points, not just focusing on firmographics or lookalikes, but I think someone mentioned like product signals. Anything that you have should go into your scoring model so that they all are almost equally weighted, at least at first. You know, so I think that was a great point, Jane.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So out of everybody, who's leading or who's using a lead scoring model internally at your organization, and who's doing that specifically within SMB? Omer's called that out a few times as a particularly like sweet spot for trying to do this in a B2B context. Jane, since you were out, you want to lead us off here?
For sure. I think, you know, a lot of people today are, you know, they have accurate information sometimes, but a lot of the times on SMBs, it's very hard to come by. And so those are the ones that really should be using the B2B lead scoring the most. And they should be, and if they're not, that's really why they come to us at Explorium, is to add in that external factor to enhance those models. You know, a lot of SMBs are not legally required to publish reports of their activities or their, you know, their revenue. They might not even have websites. They tend to open and close and move around a lot. So when it comes to scoring, you want to be using a tool like Explorium in order to enjoy higher coverage and higher accuracy on these SMBs and actually, you know, get that full 360 viewpoint on a company. So a good example of this would be like industry classification codes, for example. They don't really give a full picture on those SMBs. Sometimes the definitions are too broad or the coverage isn't full. So instead you have to, you know, cross-reference with a lot of other sources that provide other types of industry classifiers and business categories to properly categorize those SMBs. And so we work with a lot of customers who they come to us and they have that same pain point, right? That SMB data is very difficult to come by. An example of this would be a company that we're currently working with called Bluevine, an SMB lender, and they're building a fraud model. And so in order to build an accurate risk profile on those leads and improve their customer acquisition, they're using lead scoring on those SMBs and improve coverage and accuracy with Explorium in order to better classify those businesses and determine whether or not they are risky or not.
Yep, 100%. And I mean, I came from a company that provided B2B data, a lot of it in the SMB space, and I know firsthand how hard a lot of that stuff is to get to, especially when it comes to like revenue. That one's really, really hard. You can back into like company size based off of like, people that have raised their hand and say that they're a member of that organization on LinkedIn and stuff like that. But most of the stuff in SMB side of things around revenue is modeled. You're trying to back into it. And it raises a additional, important factor there. Make sure you understand your data. Because I see way too many people that are like, oh, ZoomInfo told me that this company's revenue was 10 to 20 million, and that's the beginning and end of it. And it's like, well, how reliable is that data? How reliable is that signal? And so you've got to understand at a deeper level what that actual data is telling you and how much that you should count on it. Omar, you want to chime in?
Yeah, for sure. So kind of thinking pointing back to what you said about the data, and also Jane mentioned that before, it's garbage in, garbage out, gold in, gold out in any case. So you want to know the data in SMB, in NLB space, it's really difficult to do that. One of the things that we're doing in Explorium that actually try to solve that is around kind of our machine learning engine is not only built for building models. This is not his main purpose. The main purpose is actually to recommend to our users what type of signals he should be using in an ML model. The way that we do that is actually by testing correlation, but there is a lot of IP around that. But the point is, one of the things that we also test is the integrity of the data, the consistency of the data, to make sure that this feature that you're going to feed into some model is have a high quality. That's kind of from a data perspective. One more thing that we kind of talk about, we can think about that as an SMB approach, because one of the questions that we had in the chat was about basically PLG approach, product-led growth approach. Those, I think, that are ideal for lead scoring and segmentation overall. Like when you have a new freemium user, you should add any data that you have, both internally from the product itself and externally coming from companies that sell that type of data and platform, just like Explorium, by the way. And then feed that into a model that allow you to understand how you can approach that. In a very similar way, how VP sales in a B2B company will actually approach different segment of his ICP, using his tools, the same way the product needs to address those guys, those premium users that you want to upgrade into premium, from freemium to premium. Sorry about that.
Yep. Could not agree more. And, one of the things that I hear far too few people doing whenever they're trying to build this stuff is essentially checking their work. So, hey, if we tweak this value, or if we tweak the weighting here or there, what are the implications as far as what we're trying to be able to predict out of this? And an even more crucial question is, do you have any sort of a baseline or way to gut check the results of it? Do you have something to compare that against to see, is this actually accurately predicting something versus whatever else? Another one I see way too often people failing to do is they don't even have a way to be able to check the validity of the model.
Well, Jason, I mean, this will prove to everyone that this isn't like scripted or anything, but do you have an idea why people can't do that? Do you think it's because they're like lazy, or what is your guess there? Because I think I have the answer, but I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, I'm very interested to hear your answer, but look around at what's going on right now in the tech industry and the layoffs and stuff like that. I think way too many people are in a desperate search for the next easy button, and what we just described is not easy.
Exactly, right? You need people like Explorium, or you need staff people who can do those tests and set them up. That's too much to ask a sales and marketing person to do. And I think, again, being very adjacent to sales and marketing, but being like the tech person in the room has given me a great perspective into that, because what you're being sold on from these big box vendors is like turnkey solution. You could do this, you could do that. But like when it comes to testing or tweaking the model, or maybe using a new algorithm in the back end to see if that gives you better results, all of that is completely off the table. But that's what you get with actual data scientists who are maintaining models actively, right? Even something that Jane mentioned about being able to take firmographic information from a bunch of different sources, right? Which is something I do all the time. I'm not just going to depend on ZoomInfo. I have Clearbit, I have Crunchbase, I may have a couple of other sources. You need to create a waterfall where that's all normalized into one single source of truth, industry column or employees or revenue. But getting to that point is something that requires a data plumber, right? Or an advanced solution. So like you're talking about really like basic building blocks of data science, data engineering, whatever you want to call it. And they've been left out of the conversation when it comes to B2B lead scoring, because I get it. They're trying to empower the people who are actually executing on these. But from what I've seen, the most successful lead scoring programs are when you have a partnership between highly technical people that can extend these models and build them the correct way, and people who have the subject matter expertise to drive that machine and, you know, towards revenue, hopefully, right? So again, I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but as a data person, the infrastructure speaks so loudly to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also add to that, I think feedback loops are a huge part of it. And, you know, data is constantly changing and evolving, and it's quite a process to maintain models to make sure that your waterfall of normalized data is up to date, because, you know, you have to be quick and pivot. Some sources might be good at a moment's time, and then a pandemic happens and all of a sudden their collection methods don't work. So you need to really be strong. And it's a lot of work to maintain these models and to grow them. So constantly having that feedback loop and a tool that lets you evaluate and discover the right data for that time is really key.
Yeah, I can actually also add on top of that and say that, you know, we're looking at whether or not we're going to invest the data scientist team in order to make sure that those models are good. I will take that another step. I think that many of the company doesn't actually check those type of models. It's not because they lack the skill set or anything like that, but because that they went into, let's say, a new vertical that they don't have enough data for, or they're going into, you know, a different geo that they don't want to use the same one because it's a different approach and so on. And what I think that is what I would do in those type of cases, I think that, you know, statistical models and machine learning based models can be sometime in the middle or the end of the road. You start with something basic. In many cases, if you go into a new category of a product, or a new category, new segment, you want to start with something simple, maybe even a rule-based segmentation process that will allow you just to have a very simple segmentation of your kind of inbound or outbound, whatever you choose. Then later on, when you collect enough data, then you'll be able to also use the team or any tool in order to kind of progress that into a statistical model. I think that the rule-based engine, the best way to do that, or the best kind of the advantage of those, is that is directly affecting or directly consuming the business understanding of, let's say, the sales guy that's trying to sell into those new segments.
Yep, 100%. And you know, one of the challenges within this that I run into all the time is, you know, has the data shifted over that period of time? You know, the data may have been telling you something in one place, and the context or details, ins and outs of it, all of that stuff change over time. It's the reason why my absolute favorite is when I can find a unicorn like Dave that understands both like the actual execution and go-to-market motions, but is also managing the data. So like he's got the ins and outs of what's changed, what's happened during that period of time, and can actually go in and look at that. But it also raises a similar point. I think increasingly, especially on the marketing demand gen side of things, greater expertise and fluency in analytics and data is absolutely becoming a have for somebody that's leading a marketing or demand gen team. And I think that leaders in those roles have been slow to adopt and react to that. And the ones that have are the ones that are desperately looking for that easy button versus the ones that have that background and understanding. They're better equipped to be able to ask these questions or put the right data in the hands of their analysts and stuff like that. I also think a lot of the easy button thing is, coming from senior leadership where they don't understand how hard this stuff is. And so they're reluctant to spend money on tooling or tech that enables this. They're certainly unwilling or unlikely to approve budget for somebody like me to go out and hire a Dave or something like that. And so when your hands are tied and you combine that with not having a lot of direct expertise or experience in that, it's a recipe for exactly what we've seen, I think. Awesome. All right. So out of this, how are you guys using, or have you seen lead scoring leveraged effectively for driving outbound teams? This one's obviously a huge question right now in the space because everybody got burned by adopting a model of, hey, if I add enough BDRs to my team and I equip them with enough data and enough tech that allows them to just fire away at volume, then it's going to spit something out on the other side of it. We saw that model collapse. Honestly, I think it collapsed a couple of years ago, but there was so much VC money behind everything that nobody really noticed. But if you look at the layoffs in the tech space right now, the single role that's most decimated are these outbound teams. And I think a lot of that's just come from a spray and pray. Let's throw data and and let's throw context at people, and then let's allow them to push things through a volume, and the rest will just sort itself out. So I think this is one that's absolutely vital that everybody in the space is trying to address right now.
Mm-hmm. Completely.
Sorry, Omer.
No, go ahead.
No, I'll be quick. Unfortunately, I'm very close to this, Jason, right? Like, I totally understand the shift that's been happening more recently. What I will say is what's missing is the playbook, right? The signals are really great, but you have to match those signals and whatever score, with whatever taxonomy you're giving to accounts and leads, you have to match that to some type of messaging playbook, some type of longer buyer's journey. You can't just score everyone and say people at the top of the list should be handled the same way as people at the bottom of the list, but you should just do it faster, right? There's much more context in connective tissue. So sorry I interrupted there, Omer, but I just I wanted to get that out.
I think I completely agree with you, and I think that's kind of this is where the model collapsed. This is exactly where the model collapsed, because kind of the traditional way to do outbound usually, and sometimes we do meet with customers that request 100,000, a list of 100,000, I don't know, restaurants, convenience stores, whatever they're trying to sell to. And then what they're expecting, what they think they should do is take those lists, send everyone an email, basically spam the hell of them. And then if someone raised their hand, say, now the SDR should go and talk to him. And I think that model doesn't really work, because in many cases, you'll spam the wrong companies, and the company that will raise their hand not necessarily is in the right, let's call it ICP just for now, just some high score segmentation that you actually want to approach. And I think that this is something that when we introduce, we have a completely different approach to that. And what we do is building models for lead scoring. We apply them on, list of not 100,000, but 1.5 million, 2 million of businesses. Get a list of maybe 1,000, maybe 2. It depends on what is the appetite or the capability of a customer to actually do something with those lists, and then only provide him with the top leads in a specific vertical. So now instead of 100,000 that he needs to pray that actually some of them will answer his email, we know that we have 2,000 or 1,000, depending on the customer, good customers for his sales team, and now we need to invest the resources in order to convert them. That is a completely different approach than kind of the traditional outbound approach where you just spray and pray basically.
I also think that a lot of the times too, outbound gets neglected. Inbound is characterized by few leads, but they're higher quality traditionally, right? There's some sort of intent there. And so a lot of sales and marketing teams focus on those inbound leads and neglect that outbound because it can be a lot harder to score them, right? But really they're missing out if they're not going after those outbound leads. And really the sweet spot is how can we find the highest priority between inbound and outbound that makes sense. And so focusing on bucketing them differently, scoring them differently, and sending different strategies for different reps, if you're going to email, if you're going to call, depending on a lot of those characteristics that are imputed into the model. But ultimately, you want to look both at the high priority inbound and outbound, analyze them separately, but tackle them together, and not neglecting your outbound leads, as we see quite frequently.
Absolutely. That's actually one of the reasons why I almost always dedicate my BDRs as either exclusively inbound or outbound, because anytime I've tried mixing it, it's like every bit of their day goes towards those inbound leads. And understandably, like, they're the most likely to convert, and at some level, like, you want that to be happening. But if you want outbound to also occur, it's really hard to hold those those reps that are managing both sides of the equation accountable and have them doing the outbound stuff. So yeah, that's something I've struggled with to the point where I've pretty much given up on having that one be effective. Mm-hmm. So a couple of things off of what you guys have said. One, Jane, I've been talking to a lot of people this year around like sort of the breakdown in the outbound model and the layoffs and stuff like that. And anytime I talk to somebody who's outside of our space and I describe the model to them of, hey, we're going to go hire a bunch of people straight out of college that have never had a job. We may or may not give them any training at all. We may or may not give them any sort of templates or messaging. And we're going to put them in a seat and say, fire away. And you describe that to somebody who's not been this close to the sausage making for this many years, and look at their reaction. It's like, you have to be effing kidding me. Like, how in the world did somebody come up with this, much less it be the dominant model within the space? But Dave, I think you mentioned something, in yours earlier. I think it's a critical question that people have to ask before they start trying to go down these modeling paths. And it's, what are we going to do with the insights of that model? Way too many times am I asked to go spend a whole lot of time and effort to go try and find some data point or some signal. And when I pause and ask before I go do that, what are we trying to accomplish with that? Or what are we trying to do with that? And I get a blank stare. It's like, maybe we shouldn't go down that path, or at least not yet until we've got an idea around how we're going to operationalize that, how we're going to put that into effect. And, corollary to that, have you really explored what data sources are out there, what signals are out there, and really been able to, say there's not anything that gets the job done? I see way too many people going and recreating the wheel whenever it's like, hey, if you just went over there and used that, like, it would have been just as good for you.
Yeah, Jason, I mean, I think it's even simpler. Like, you just need a spreadsheet with every activity that's part of your models and how it maps to like a real world action, right? And again, I think that I know that companies glean and gloss over that because they just have like one score to rule them all. You have people asking about, oh, how should product signals come up? How do I manage like a data model across sales ops and marketing? It's like, well, then you should have 3 different buckets of your score, or maybe 3 different scores. Maybe you should have a product score, a marketing score, and a sales score. And based on those scores, they're handled differently. High marketing score goes into your marketing automation platform. The high sales scores is outbound targets, and the high product scores, maybe you sent them a coffee mug or something, right? Or I don't know. But again, there's not that level of granularity. And it really I haven't seen it in any of the off-the-shelf products, right? So I think to your point, it's an easy exercise to map things in a spreadsheet to one another, but how to productionize that and realize the actual value of it is where people are falling short.
Yeah, and it gets back to that specificity of the question that you're asking. Typically, the more specific the question is, the more reliable the data and signal that you're going to pull out of the model is going to be. The more that you leave it up to, chance, or, the model's going to sort this out for me or whatever, the less reliable those results or signals are going to be. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about AI and big data and all of that stuff. It's like, if we just feed it all in there, it's going to go figure it out for me. And that's obviously not a super effective strategy.
It's actually the opposite, Jason. It could lead you right into the buzzsaw. And I see Omer shaking his head, so he knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Have the scars to prove.
Well, and
it's not only it's not hypothetical. I have the actual scar to show that.
You and me both. Awesome. So, yeah, this is a no-brainer answer, but I'm interested to hear you guys unpack the reasons for it. Is lead scoring a one-off activity or an ongoing process? Is anybody going to shock me and say it's a one-time activity?
No, the question
Okay. I don't think so.
What would be the argument is, why is that an ongoing versus one time? What would be the argument? What is the most important argument around that? That would be interesting.
Exactly. So unpack that for me. Why is this not a one-time activity? Why is this an ongoing initiative?
Should I start?
Sure. Have at it.
And I was so aggressive with the question. So here's my take, and I'm sure that each one of us will have a different approach for that. I think that sales overall is something that is always changing. Like if you think about your ICP as a good example, as a good starting point for this discussion, your ICP is constantly evolving, whether you want that or not. By the way, some companies try not to, but it's not something that it's not static, right? It's dynamic in nature. You always kind of figure out a new pocket of value that you can address and understand that other pockets maybe it was in the same ICP, but now you have a new signal that say, yeah, I'm looking for a company. I'm looking for a restaurant company in New York. Those are my ICP. But restaurant that sell vegan is actually something. Vegan menus I'm more successful in that than the rest of the company. So all of a sudden your ICP have changed, and so does your models, by the way. And models are in nature or adapt to do that. If you retrain the model over and over again, especially online models, think about that, something that is being trained every hour, every half an hour, it doesn't really matter, but just in an ongoing manner, they will change, they will shift. And there is also tools to make sure that the shift will be controlled in that sense. So I definitely think that it's ongoing, and I would blame that as on the dynamic of ICP and how ICP is changed by nature.
I think it needs to be ongoing. I mean, if we're talking about CRMs, like that's the heart of a go-to-market organization too. It needs to be up to date. So your sales force is where all of your reps, your teams are going in to see the scores, what they should tackle, as well as the different data points as well. And those need to be as up to date as possible. And as we discussed earlier, they need to be different for each of the different teams. So your business needs can change, but also over time, the data can change as well. And so keeping that CRM up to date is really crucial, especially as times go on and you need to pivot. Maybe a data source isn't available to you anymore or can't be used in a model, whatever that may be. It might be your decision, it might not be, but you need to constantly keep retraining and keep updating to keep the source of truth of your CRM as up to date and fresh as possible.
Yeah, Jane hit on it there. She hit on it earlier. Data staleness is a thing. I mean, there's all sorts of studies out there that tells you how fast data spoils. And I think it's extra relevant here when you talk about buying signals. In every scoring model that I've built, the number one indicator of if an account or an individual is going to buy is the recency in which they have engaged with your product, your platform, some type of marketing content, something or other, right? So you have to be doing this continuously or you'll miss the recency signal, which again, in my experiences, has been like one of the most heavily weighted towards success.
Absolutely. And yeah, the reasons for that are myriad. Basically, the end answer to it, everything going into that model shifts. And it shifts constantly. So it's your ICP, it's your product, it's your company's reputation and brand, it's the target personas that you're going after, it's the competition, it's macro effects going on, within the economy or world affairs, it's micro effects at a local level. Like every one of these things has different impacts on it, and they're always constantly shifting. It's the reason why, as a demand gen marketer by trade and experience, I hate the idea of growth hacks because no sooner do you find one and it's like, oh shit, like this is really effective. Like, this is really moving the needle. It's like, okay, now all the competition has learned it. and now all of your targets have gotten sophisticated about it, and so no longer does it work. And so if you're somebody that's functioning off of growth hack to growth hack, like it's a never ending rat race of trying to find the next one versus trying to really hone the expertise for how do you actually do this and do this well and uncover insights on a regular basis and a regular clip. And so honing those skills and spending your time and effort there is much, much more effective than going and searching for your next growth hack that may last for days, weeks. At best I've seen one that'll last like a few months, but it usually is not very effective for very long. All right. Well, we've got quite a few questions from the audience. We've answered some of them in the chat, but let's make sure we've got enough time. For anybody who's not dropped anything in here, please go ahead and do that. So one thing, so back to the no-code tools, Daria mentioned, but you can integrate AI tools into no-code solutions. And in fact, Dave, you and I were talking about some of the effective ways to do this a week or two ago. But have you guys seen that as an effective way of marrying two different strategies within this?
I'm not saying it's impossible, but very specific. I tried to incorporate ChatGPT into some code, and I tried to do it with a tool called N8N before I did it with code. I think N8N is like a real great workflow tool where you can hook things together. I had all sorts of authentication issues. I couldn't extend it to the level that I wanted to do. I took it to Python. I did it natively there, and I was able to create what I wanted and even more so in a shorter amount of time. So it's obviously dependent on the individual that's doing the work, but I always see some type of limitation to no-code tools. So that's me.
True, but I think that because you are well versed in Python and other programming tools, it's easy to say that there is a disadvantage of using no-code tools if you know how to code. But the fact is that many don't. So
I'm a little biased. You're 100% right. Yes.
Awesome. Jason asked, how can you effectively use tools, analytics to be able to apply that to like a freemium or a free trial PLG model? Within that, y'all go ahead and chime in really quickly. When I was at Cirrus, this was our entire model. So we were low touch, no touch, B2C motion. Come to the website before you had to go to the Chrome store to install an extension. So they could click the button on the homepage, install the extension straight from there, OAuth through Salesforce, literally 15 seconds, and they were up and running. And we were doing 2,500 plus trial starts a month when I was there. The only way I could effectively manage that volume, especially with a bootstrap startup, was to manage it with tools to give us signals out of that. And I think this is also an important part. Those signals need to be for different use cases and different roles and departments within the organization. So we were using those for sales to be able to say, hey, these are the ones that are likely to convert. These are the ones that are unlikely to convert. Great lesson with that. Have your sales team focus on those in the middle. The ones that are likely to convert are likely to convert anyway. The ones that are unlikely to convert, there's not much you can do. The ones that are on the edge, that's where their time and attention needs to be spent. Same story for marketing. You can look at that data and say, what are my most successful cohorts? And where do I go to find more of those? What are the ones that are not converting, not engaging, all of that stuff? But one of the biggest ones is the product team. Hey, what are people doing as they come into that platform? What are the features that are really sticky? What are the features that are really, really tied to people that ultimately convert? And provide that impact or input back to the product team and as well as the product marketing team. So be specific with and be creative with where you go with those signals and what you do with them.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned about tackling the middle group is really key here. And that's where you want to use the external data in order to hone in and offer something more personalized, not just firing the same emails about the same different product offerings that you're giving. You want to be tailored based on the persona, based on their behavior, based on any other factors that you can pull about them. So it's really crucial to focus on that group and personalize what you're sharing with them so that you can increase your engagement.
Yep. Back to that specificity. The more specific you are with what you're targeting, what you're trying to move the needle against, what question you have, the more effective all of this is going to be. It's the reason why I tell my team is like, let's start as dead simple as humanly possible. And let's figure that piece out, and then let's layer complexity as needed. And then we'll gradually work our way up. But start extremely specific and start extremely simple, and then work your way up from there. All right, cool. We had a not really a question, but an insight. That Zoom info is not always as reliable. For anybody not monitoring the chat, piece of feedback I had there is be sophisticated as a data consumer. Not only are not all data providers created equally, the data each one of those providers provide is not created equally. So some may have specific strengths within specific data points or within specific segments or verticals or personas. Maybe, hey, these are great for like direct dial phone numbers, but their company size data is absolutely terrible. So again, be a good consumer of your data. Understand your data. Don't just feed it in blindly. Is the biggest lesson there. Let's see.
I'd also just add on.
So
quickly.
Yeah,
I think it's really important not to rely just on one source as well. You want to have a waterfall of sources because things can change, and you can run different evaluations on a Zoom info, and they might be great on certain things that you're interested in, but you need to look holistically across the board at everything that you want. And SMB data is one area that's very difficult, and you usually cannot rely on one source just for that SMB data. So you need to create a waterfall in order to improve your coverage. But beyond that as well, you can use these other sources to cross-reference with each other and validate. That's a lot of the value that actually we're doing at Explorium is combining and aggregating and doing the entity resolution for you, because one source of truth with data is not something that we're at today. And so you have to go beyond just a Zoom info and improve your accuracy and your coverage by layering in multiple sources.
100%. All right, Dave, this one I'm going to throw to you first because it's near and dear to both of our hearts, and we spent an inordinate amount of time at Astronomer working on this. How do you align what's going on the lead scoring analytics side of things with demand gen, with ops, with success, with sales? How do you actually operationalize that effectively and bridge those gaps, especially whenever a lot of times you're working with people that are not very sophisticated in their understanding of what this is?
Keep it simple, right? I think this was Janine's questions. And everything that someone is doing across any technology that you have, any system that you have, it's an activity. Put all of those activities in one table with a date and an identifier, and you can tell any story, right? Whether you're a data scientist or whether you're not. Make things simple. What most people try to do is get more complicated when they have more systems. Then they buy more tech. Now they have Fivetran and Snowflake and DBT, and all of their problems still aren't solved. Don't know, what do I do, right? Keep it very simple. Put everything into one table, and then get more complicated as needed. That's my answer.
Completely agree, but I can double click on that and just add one thing to that. I think that one of the things that is very difficult, especially when you're trying to kind of, I will say, lubricant the path between marketing and sales, is that both of them are using very different systems, very different enrichments in many cases. So the marketing team can use, some platform in order to enrich their data, but then the sales team use a completely different platform, completely different tools. And I think one of the things that makes it very easier to work within those two organizations is to unify the systems. So the platform is the same, the enrichment is the same, the data is the same. That's where all revenue operation as a profession rose in the last couple of years, exactly because of that. Because there need to be unification in terms of the processes and the systems between those two organizations.
Awesome. So we're coming up at the end of the hour. I'll get the last word in. One of the biggest ones that I've seen for driving alignment is have a strong relationship with those teams, or at least a strong relationship with a handful of people on those teams. if you work with them, if you consult with them, if you have them actively engaged with and bought into what you're trying to do and deliver, and you can run a pilot through them, work out the kinks, the inevitable things that aren't working right, whatever, and then come out to the rest of the team with like, okay, we've actually piloted this, we've tested it, we've worked out the kinks. Here are these awesome results that have been delivered relative to that. And now you've got a, an advocate within that team. And I mean, you want to talk about the most effective way to get a sales team to adopt something or move in a direction, have one of their peers say, holy crap, I closed this huge deal and got a fat commission check because I did this. It's like everybody on that team will now follow that lead and go do that. So it's the reason why I always have, ideally 2 to 3. If you get much bigger than that, then you wind up herding cats and trying to like figure out what's going on. But people, sort of skunk works within that team that I'll work with to build this out and be able to roll that out and, test it out and improve effectiveness. So that one's been huge for me in trying to actually operationalize things like this. All right, guys, we are at the end of our time. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you guys so much for coming on and joining us. This has been great questions from the audience. We'll send out a recap email with a link to it. Reply to that email. Hit us up on Slack in the RevGenius community if you have additional questions for us. Happy to continue the conversation there. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
See ya.